Hey guys, 7th here. Going to get right to the point. A couple of months ago, Blackb0nd posted a video about the fact that Sega had purchased Atlus and that Atlus would have full access to Sega's back catalog. Not long after he posted that, he asked me to make a video about what games I thought Atlus should focus on as far as what to sequelize, what to reboot, what to give an HD revision, and so on. Well, the hard thing about that is, much like the NES era, what a lot of people think of as Nintendo games were not really Nintendo games. They were games published on Nintendo system that were made by third parties. I mean, as much as people talk about how great Nintendo's first-party games are, yes, everyone loved Mario, yes, everyone loved Metroid and whatnot, but a lot of people, when you talk to them, their greatest memories of playing the NES are of third-party games like Castlevania, Mega Man, that sort of thing. And it's very much similar with Sega. A lot of Sega's best, most loved games are actually third-party games, and it was even less obvious back when the Genesis first started out because every game was being released with that same black grid artwork, so it made it look like everything was a Sega game, and then you got it home and you booted it up and it would tell you that it was developed by Capcom and was just published by Sega or what have you. So a lot of games that people think of as Sega Genesis games, for example, like Forgotten Realms. Forgotten Realms is actually a Capcom game. Or Midnight Resistance. Midnight Resistance is actually a Data East game. So by saying what Sega games, it really limits it. And I know that that's what Blackb0nd meant, because those are the only franchises that Sega had, that Atlus, I should say, is going to have access to. But when you do that, it really limits what I can pick from as far as what I would like to see come back. Plus, the fact of the matter is that most of the exclusives that have been on Sega systems were arcade ports, and so again you end up limiting yourself. So I'm going to actually break from what Blackb0nd asked for. I am going to give him what he asked for, but I'm also going to add to it. And so instead of just covering Sega developed and published games, I'm just going to bring up games on classic Sega systems that I would like to see rebooted, redone, re-released, etc. Now, the one that he was most interested in, unfortunately, was the Sega Saturn. Long story short, the Saturn wasn't very popular, and so there are a lot fewer copies of some of their more sought-after games floating out there in the market space. And I have not... all of the games that I'm going to mention for the Saturn I owned at one point, but were mistakenly sold in a yard sale several years ago, and I haven't gotten around to repurchasing them. I do have some Saturn games, a good number of them, but none of them were ones that I cared enough about to particularly to have them rebooted. So I'm going to bring up some Saturn games right now that I would like to see rebooted, but I don't have any actual gameplay of those particular games simply because I don't currently own them. The first one, obviously right out of the gate, is Panzer Dragoon Saga. This was a RPG that was based on the previous rail shooter series of Panzer Dragoon, the series that has more or less been remade on Xbox One with Crimson Dragon, although it doesn't really play quite the same, but it's in the same spirit, in the same vein, with a bunch of microtransaction bullshit thrown in. But still, Crimson Dragon is a continuation of it. Panzer Dragoon Saga was a 4-disc game. It had a very limited run at the end of Saturn's life cycle. I think there was maybe 7,200 copies of it released in the States, and the only reason that I had one was because I pre-ordered it 6 months before it came out. And I think at the yards, I don't even know what it went for at the yard sale. It wasn't supposed to be there. The wrong box was picked up along with a bunch of my other shit. But you'll notice that one has never made it to the digital scene, and the reason being is because Sega, in a couple of years ago in an interview stated that they had actually lost all of the original data files for Panzer Dragoon Saga. They don't have the original music files, they don't have any of the textures, they don't have none of it. It's all gone. The only existing copies of Panzer Dragoon Saga in existence are the ones that were pressed on a disc for the Sega Saturn. And that's it. And that's why you haven't seen it digitally. Now, the game itself right now goes for close between $300 and $400 for a complete still with the box copy. And so you can imagine why that one's one that I haven't really gone out of my way to get back yet. I'll eventually get it, but I don't have it right now. And that one, I just feel that it would be a good series to bring back. It was a very unique RPG. It didn't really play like any other RPG out there, and would have been the Saturn's answer to Final Fantasy had it actually been promoted, had some money behind it, etc. So I'd really like to see that one back. Next up would be Shining the Holy Ark. Shining the Holy Ark is the sequel to a Genesis game that I'm going to be mentioning later on in this video. Next up would be Fighters Mega Mix. And the fact that I've never heard Blackb0nd bring this game up just astounds me, because it was pretty much, in my opinion, the premier fighting game of the 32-bit console era. Basically, Fighters Mega Mix was a game that took all the characters from the Virtual Fighter series and all of the characters from Fighting Vipers, which was Sega's other big fighting series of that era, and put them all together in one game. Next up would be Burning Rangers. Burning Rangers was a title that was released towards the end of the Saturn life cycle, and it was a third-person action game where you played basically a firefighter in the future. You flew around in this kind of Iron Man type bio armor, and you're running around in space stations that have caught fire, and you're putting fires out, and you're rescuing people that have been trapped, that kind of stuff. Next up would be Albert Odyssey. Albert Odyssey was a remake of a Super Nintendo RPG that was only released in Japan. And it was your classic turn-based Japanese RPG, but it was one of those RPGs that just had something about it. You know, you started playing it, and you just couldn't put it down. You had to play it through to the finish. And they never made an Albert Odyssey 2. It was never continued on. It didn't have the popularity that Lunar or what have you would have, simply because they never brought it to the States on the SNES, and you know, Working Designs brought it to the Saturn. But at any rate, that's it for Saturn games, and now you're going to get to watch some stuff that has actual gameplay. So, what's some more classic Sega games that I would like to see brought back? Here we go. Alright, let's start with an oldie but a goodie. This is Alien Storm for the Sega Genesis. This was a two-player side-scrolling beat-em-up, and if I'm not mistaken, it ran on essentially the same engine as the Golden Axe series on the Genesis did. You'll notice some definite similarities to the character models, to the music, to the way some of the movement works, and the general game itself. You had three different characters you could pick from. You had these two that you see here, or you also had a female character, which of course was your, you know, everyone called her Ripley, even though that wasn't her name, simply because of the alien aspect to it. It was all close quarters combat. You didn't really have a lot of long distance attacking. You had to get right up on them. But one thing that I found fun was these little interludes where you had these first-person shooting sections that had a very arcade feel. Now, of course, you couldn't use a light gun with this, but it was still a lot of fun, especially in two-player where you're fighting to get the health ups and whatnot. And I know they kind of ruined the Golden Axe series with their attempt to reboot it a few years ago, but still, I'd like to see what Atlus could do with this game, because I had a lot of fun with it, especially with my friends back in the day. Next up is Cyborg Justice. This game came out the year I graduated high school, and I'm going to come out and say it, the game was known more for its customability and being one of those so bad it's good type of games, because we'd all sit and laugh at each other getting our asses handed to us in this game because of how bad the controls were. But the concept is sound. You can pick out your parts to customize your robot, and then you go out and attempt to kick some ass, even though all the robots are more powerful than you are, have bigger, longer life bars and better attacks, and you basically have to build up your arsenal of what you can build your robot out of to get a robot that can actually last to the end of the game. Now this one should be an easy one for Atlus. This is Crusader of Sentai, which was a Zelda clone for the Genesis. Again, this one was released, I believe, in 1992 or 93. And why it should be an easy one for Atlus is because it's a game that was developed by Atlus. So Atlus, get off your ass, bring this game to the future here, because I really loved this one. It was a lot of fun. You could actually acquire animals, almost like Pokemon, that when you added them and you see them following you around here, it could change your abilities as far as what you could do, different kinds of attacks, things like that. But fun little action RPG, great little Zelda clone. Atlus, get off your ass and bring it back. Of course, I can't mention Sega JRPGs without bringing up Skies of Arcadia. This was the final fantasy of the Dreamcast roster. It did eventually make its way to the GameCube as well in an enhanced version, but there, to my knowledge, have not been any sequels. Maybe there was one in Japan and I just haven't heard anything about it, but there certainly hasn't been any sequels released in the States. It was more of your traditional Japanese RPG, your turn-based style Japanese RPG. Graphics were very good for its time, had a nice lengthy quest, and some of the boss battles were done as airship battles between your pirate ship and various different flying enemies and a giant golden robot towards the end of the game. And you not only built up your characters, but you had to build up your ship so your ship would survive these strategic flying battles. Great little game, and I have no idea why this series never continued on. It certainly should have. Next up is Mechs. This was a Genesis title. It was also an arcade game, and kind of a mixture of Contra and Commando, with a little bit of Akari Warriors thrown into the mix. It was a good arcade game, good vertical scrolling shooter. You had a lot of different weapons you could choose from, and the graphics were really good for its time. I still have a lot of fun with this one when I play it. And speaking of Contra clones, you've got Midnight Resistance. Now, of course, this was an arcade game from Data East. You heard me mention this one earlier. The Genesis version was not arcade perfect by any means. The arcade sticks in the original arcade game could be rotated to control the angle at which your gun was pointed. Now, you can choose to have that kind of game mode with this by holding down one of the buttons to rotate the gun, but that makes the game a hell of a lot harder. It's not the same thing as being able to twist your joystick, that's for damn sure. So it's more of your traditional Contra-style aiming. And one downside to it is the music is a bit repetitive, but what was cool was instead of just picking up people's guns when they dropped them or stuff airlifted to you, you actually had to save keys and purchase the upgrades that you wanted. And for those upgraded weapons, there was limited ammo, so you had to purchase ammo too, along with shower bombs, shields, that kind of stuff. Now, of course, you've got Sega's answer to the Final Fight series, Streets of Rage. The sprites were not as big as in Streets of Rage, graphics not quite as good, but the music was a hell of a lot better, and the move set for each character was larger than what you got in the original Final Fight. This was a great two-player game, and I remember actually going out and buying this game the day that it came out. And of course, these games are fairly short, so it didn't take me too long to beat it. This one has, I think, 7 levels. Yeah, 7 levels. And it's one of these games where you really have to have your friends along to get the most out of it. Now, if the music you're hearing in the background, if that music sounds familiar to you, now you know where Blackb0nd got his little musical interlude that goes with his Evil Duck intro. It's right here. He got it from the boss battles of Streets of Rage. So in case you didn't already know that before, now you do know. Zombies Revenge for the Dreamcast. This was a third-person action title where you used both guns and your fists. Very arcadey. In fact, I think at one point it was a very limited release on arcade. Graphics were good for it being a Dreamcast title. You'll notice it had kind of fixed camera angles. There wasn't really any rotation going on, so you did occasionally run into issues with the camera. Otherwise, it was a really fun title. I got a lot of enjoyment out of it. Weapon selection could have been better, and I guess for Dreamcast the graphics were good. I mean, it didn't, by no means did it hold up once the PS2 came out. Come to think of it now, though, I think Atlus, you can actually skip this one. I believe Capcom actually beat you to this one a year or two ago.
What?
They called it Resident Evil 6. Here's a lesser-known game for the Sega Genesis. This was called Jewel Master. Now, Jewel Master is a side-scrolling action game where you are a magic user, and you can change your abilities using a ring system. Which rings you put on changes the different magic skills that you can use. Now, when you first look at it, you would think that it was a clone of Alicia Dragoon or Mystic Defender, but in all honesty, it plays more like the old Sega arcade game Rostan, only you're using magic instead of swords. Then you have Speed Devils for the Dreamcast. This was my favorite Dreamcast racing title. And I know people say, but what about Sega GT? And what about Metropolis Street Racer, the precursor to the Gotham Street Racing series on the Xbox? Well, you know, I have always been more of an arcadey racer fanatic than I have been the simulators. Every now and again, if I want to play a simulator, I'll play Gran Turismo. I don't really care about the others out there that much. For me, like this previous gen, my racing game of choice was Burnout Paradise. Once I'd gotten into Burnout Paradise, I didn't need another racing game. And that's one of the reasons why I liked Speed Devils, why it was my favorite. Because the action in it was so funny. Like in this level, for example, you're dodging mechanical King Kongs and dinosaurs. And another level, you're dodging tornadoes and buildings set on fire. And in one level out in the desert, your car can get picked up and abducted by UFOs. Now, I've said many times that my favorite side-scrolling shoot-'em-up of all time is Thunder Force 3 on the Genesis, which was a Technosoft game and was very inferiorly remade on the Super Nintendo as Thunder Spirits, which is a piece of shit compared to the Genesis version. This is a lesser-known shooter that was published in the States by Renovation, and it's called Arrow Flash. And it's not one of the more difficult shooters. It's a lot easier compared to a Thunder Force or a Gradius or what have you. But it's a lot of fun, and one of the mechanics that makes it fun is that you can transform your ship from a ship design into a robot, which changes the way your weapons work, changes the way your special move works that you can use against bosses and what have you. The level variety is really awesome. The boss fights are really fun, although, as you can see, they don't necessarily offer the greatest challenge if you build your special move up and don't use it during the level. Now you got Shining Force. A lot of people like to say that Shining Force was the inspiration for games like Final Fantasy Tactics or Tactics Ogre. It's not really the case. This style of gameplay had been done in Japanese-only released games prior to Shining Force, but Shining Force was one of the first ones in the States to hit it big. I mean, if anything, Shining Force really drew inspiration from the Fire Emblem series, which of course didn't hit the States until I believe it was Game Boy Advance several years later. But it had actually been out in Japan years and years before that, and for whatever reason never made it statewide. And Shining Force drew a lot of inspiration from that series. But it was possibly the first great strategy RPG on American consoles, the Japanese style. It's been copied and mimicked a lot since then, and the downside to it is that after this series came out, you had Shining Force 1, which is what you're looking at now. This is the final boss fight for Shining Force 1. Then you had Shining Force 2, which was also on the Genesis. Then you had Shining Force CD for the Sega CD. And then you had Shining Force 3 on the Saturn. The downside to it is that Shining Force 3 was split into, I believe, 3 parts, and only the first part was released in the States. The saddest part about it is that this series was actually brought back in the 6th generation on the PlayStation 2, and they were awful. They did not play like this at all. They were not strategy. They were more action RPG based. Now, Sega did bring back the Shinobi series on PS2, but the game was kind of crap. It felt like a low-rent Ninja Gaiden wannabe as far as like the new Ninja Gaiden series. It wasn't overly good. It was so-so, but not great. But this is not actually a full-fledged Shinobi game. This was kind of a side story to the Shinobi game series. This was called Shadow Dancer, and one of the big differences with it, as you can see, is you had a dog that followed you around everywhere, and what you could do with that dog is get it to charge enemies and attack them, and while they were busy trying to fight off the dog, you could run up and kill them. Next up is the Grandia series. Now, a lot of people think of this as a PlayStation series, but it's not. The original Grandia was first released on the Sega Saturn, but only in Japan, and then later on it was ported to the PlayStation 1. And then you had Grandia 2, which was on the Dreamcast and the PlayStation 2, and then you had a Grandia 3 on PlayStation 2, and then it just stopped. Grandia has not been brought back since that time, and even if it was just as a 3DS RPG, I'd love to see more Grandia. This was a great little series, and I think it deserved a lot more attention than it got. Next up is one that I mentioned when I was talking about Jewel Master. This is Mystic Defender. This was one of the first Sega Genesis titles. In fact, it might have been a launch title. I remember it being in the commercials for the Sega Genesis launch. And this is another game where you are using magic powers to get through a side-scrolling action-style title. Alex Kidd. Sega pretty much abandoned Alex Kidd when it just wasn't matching the popularity of Mario. They replaced him with Sonic, and you never really heard from him again. Every game of Alex Kidd was nothing like the previous ones because they just couldn't figure out what they wanted to do with him. Every game had a different style, including boss fights that were rock, paper, scissors, and it was just not... there was potential always there, but they never really figured out what they wanted to do with him. And looking at this, I'm sure you're wondering why I would say bring this back, and you know, I've changed my mind too. Fuck Alex Kidd. Light Crusader. Light Crusader was a action RPG, an isometric action RPG, that was released towards the end of the Genesis life cycle in 1995. It was developed by Treasure, the same folks behind Sin and Punishment, and Bang.io, and Dynamite Headdy, and the really horrible Ronald McDonald game for the Genesis, and of course the ever-popular and legendary Gunstar Heroes series. When looking at it, you would almost think it was kind of a Japanese take on Diablo. It's not that in-depth, folks, but it is a fun isometric RPG. Then you have Phantasy Star. This is Phantasy Star 4 you're looking at right now. I know you're going to say, well, 7th, Phantasy Star has been around for years and years now. A new one comes out every couple of years. They just released one for Vita and PS3. No, that's continuation of Phantasy Star Online. Phantasy Star Online does not play anything like Phantasy Star. Phantasy Star Online is a sci-fi take on Diablo. You just run out there, kill some stuff, come back, and you're done. It's almost like Phantasy Star Online plays almost like a precursor to Monster Hunter with a sci-fi vibe. That is not what this is. Phantasy Star was a overhead traditional Japanese RPG. Bring it back, Sega. Bring it back, Atlus. Alright, this is Beyond Oasis. This was another attempt by Sega to have their own Zelda-type series. And as you can see, you know, the sprites were much bigger. Graphics compared to the earlier Zelda titles. The animation, there's a lot more to the animation, as you can see here. But this series just didn't really take off. I don't know if it was because of the whole Arabian vibe that it had, you know, the whole Aladdin-ish feel that the game has. or if it was just considered too bland a derivative, but it was not a massive super hit, even though it got a lot of hype when it was coming out. It did have a kind of remake, kind of sequel on the Sega Saturn, but of course being a Saturn-only title meant that hardly anyone besides, well, me, played it. And that's why a lot of people don't remember this series or have never heard of it. It was a fun series. It was not the Zelda killer that Sega was hoping for, but it was still a lot of fun, and I'd like to see what current developers could take it and make of it. And here we go with Eternal Champions. This is the one that you've heard Blackb0nd mention frequently. This was Sega's attempt to have something to compete with Street Fighter, with Mortal Kombat, what have you. It was an exclusive fighter that was only available on the Genesis, and then they had a re-release with new music and I think a couple of new characters on the Sega CD. It is not the greatest fighting game in the world. I'm not sure what it is about this game that sets it apart in Blackb0nd's mind, because he has mentioned it a number of times. It's a good, competent fighter, but none of the characters are interesting. They don't really have cool backstories or anything like that, and there's nothing in the fighting itself that makes it unique or stand out from other fighters of that era, especially with all the SNK stuff that was coming out for the Genesis at that time. Jock and the Forever Man. This was a game that, if I remember right, was based on a comic that was out at the time. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I seem to remember reading that in an article about the game before it came out. That it was based on a comic series. In some ways, it is a Metroidvania style game in that you do choose which areas you want to fight through this central portal hub type area. It's not so much in that you have certain areas that are only accessible when you get this or that, but it still has a kind of a Castlevania feel to it. Not classic Castlevania. There were some challenging jumps in this game that would equate to rather unfair deaths, but I like this game a lot overall. Ristar. Ristar was, again, a game released later on in the Genesis life cycle, and as you can see, it runs on the same engine as Sonic the Hedgehog 3. The game was not heavily promoted. It didn't get a whole lot of press when it came out. I had not even heard of it the first time I saw it on a shelf, and then I brought it home, and being a big platformer fan, I loved it. Yes, it's very cutesy in its look, but then again, so was Sonic the Hedgehog, and everybody loves Sonic the Hedgehog. It had a unique mechanic with the stretch arms, as you can see, as far as getting around and how you attacked enemies. The game was a lot of fun. This one was included on the Genesis Collection disc that came out for Xbox 360 and PS3 a few years ago, so you can play it on it if you don't want to go get the original card or don't have a Genesis. But I'd like to see this series continue because I thought it was a fun game and they only ever released one. Okay, so you heard me mention a game when talking about the Saturn called Shining the Holy Ark, and I mentioned that it was a sequel. Well, this is the game that it sequelized. This is Shining in the Darkness for the Sega Genesis, and this was a dungeon crawler style RPG. Again, it was kind of similar in a 16-bit-ish kind of way to playing Eye of the Beholder. The maps were a lot more simple, and the battles were, of course, turn-based, but the storyline was really cool, and I really liked the animation style, which had more of a mid-80s cartoon look to it than it did a Japanese game. It's just a lot of fun, and this was one of those games where you'd break out your graph paper and map the dungeons out as you played, because as you can see, this is what the game was like. If you didn't map out the dungeons, you would get lost and you would die. Mapping them out was the only way to survive. and then every now and again you'd get a random battle pop up, and you take care of business, and then you were on to the next thing. But that was what made this game fun, was mapping the dungeons out, making your maps and whatnot. And I don't know how they would recreate this in modern generations because of the fact that we have the graphics to really do first-person viewpoint like in Skyrim or whatnot. But, you know, if they could remake this as kind of a fun, wacky take on a Skyrim type game, like a Skyrim but with a really off-kilter sense of humor and art style, I'd really get behind that. Last but not least, we have Shenmue for the Dreamcast. Now, yes, this one did have its sequel released on the original Xbox in the States, which I do have on the shelf back here. But it didn't really get the exposure that it needed because it was a Dreamcast game, and hardly anyone bought it when it came out, the sequel, when it came out on Xbox. And this was a series that was supposed to have multiple games to it when it came out to finish out the story, and it just didn't work out that way because at the time that it came out, it was one of the most expensive games ever made. It did the whole open world, go do anything type of gameplay well before Grand Theft Auto 3. Interesting side note, this game is one that Blackb0nd likes to name drop it, but he recently admitted to me that he's never actually played this game. And I said, well, why are you name dropping this all the time if you've never even played it? It kind of makes you a bit of a fraud there, son. And he was like, well, that's why I asked you to make the video, because you're an authority on Sega games. And you know, you can play that sidestep all you want, Bond, but you have name dropped this game an awful lot for a game that you've never played. We already know that you have a Dreamcast. You've got no excuse for not having played this game. You know, you can't talk to Baron about never having beat a Zelda game, but you talk about Shenmue and have mentioned Shenmue and you've never fucking played it. So you need to go beat Shenmue. You know, you can't talk to Baron anymore about not beating Zelda until you go beat Shenmue. Thus speaketh the seventh. I'm done. Wii U definitive versions. Owned! True next gen. Owned! We'll sell big this Christmas. Owned!